Greetings everyone, and thanks so much for watching this 6th installment in our tutorial on making Wargames terrain from broken toys. A couple of things have been done to our model off camera since the end of our last video. The first thing is I painted our tree brown. I know that's not a very exciting thing to watch, so I figured you wouldn't mind if I did it off camera. You'll remember it was the same olive drab that we sprayed over everything. The second thing that we did is that we've changed our rust surface a little bit. After I was done, I had a good look at it. I thought, I put a little bit too much rust on it. I couldn't really see the green anymore. So I went back and used exactly the same process. I took this stippling brush, put it in olive drab paint, and then I went back over some of the higher areas to tone the rust down a little bit. That actually had something of an unintended effect. It turns out that you may not be able to see it as well on this camera, but because we have colored layered over the rust, and the rust was done with a thicker acrylic paint that kind of produced a texture, it now looks like the rust is bubbling up through the paint. So it was completely by accident, but it was a much better effect than I had originally intended. So I'm going to add that to my process if I ever have to do rust again. The third thing you might notice is that our model's very, very shiny. And that is because I have applied a coat of varnish. One of the most important things you can do as a wargamer is to protect your paint job. Because as these things get handled, your paint will rub off. And you'll remember this is actually yellow plastic under here. So we certainly don't want any of that showing through. It may cause you to wonder why I have chosen a gloss varnish for this application, because a gloss varnish over rust really doesn't look very natural. It's actually part of a very old wargaming technique that they call bullet coating. Because even as you handle a varnish, the varnish will rub off with continued use. And this isn't a model. It's not going to sit on a shelf. I mean, we're going to be moving this thing around, and as we continue to handle it, the varnish comes off. It is well known that gloss varnishes are more durable than matte or flat varnishes. And what you can do is coat something first with gloss to get the protection, then cover it with a layer of matte varnish, which will take the gloss down. So then what ends up happening is, as you continue to handle this model, or it also works for any wargaming thing, if you paint miniature figures, the same technique will apply. As you rub off your matte varnish, you will see the shine coming through from the gloss. So as soon as you see the gloss on your figure, you'll know that you're wearing off your varnish, and it's time to add another layer of matte to protect your paint. This is one of the ways you can really prolong the life of your Wargames terrain and your wargaming figures. So now that we have this gloss taken care of, I'm going to add a coat of matte over it, and then we're going to get started with the vegetation. All right, 3 coats of gloss and 1 coat of matte varnish later, and our paint job is protected for the ages. It just occurred to me, though, that I haven't showed you guys any of the products that were used in finishing this. First, this is a gloss acrylic sealer. You can get something like this at basically any craft store. This Krylon Fusion, which is useful, it also bonds to plastic. That's another high-quality gloss finish. And the matte finish that I used, I just happened to have a can of this old Games Workshop Purity Seal, but you can also buy a matte finish at any craft store. So now that our matte varnish is on, our paint job is protected, now it's time for us to start gluing on some foliage. So I'm going to go set up our work area for that, and we'll be right back. And the time has come for us to begin work on vegetation. Vegetation is the one element of any Wargames project that really sets it apart and really makes it an eye-catching thing on the table. We're going to use roots to begin with, right? Because whenever we work from the inside out, or we work from the ground up. If we're going to do vegetation, we're going to work from the ground up, we need roots. And you can sculpt these, you can make these out of a number of different things, but I found the very best thing to use for roots are actual roots. These are left over from a landscaping project more than a year ago. I took some of these, cleaned them up, and put them in a bag. And Now we're ready to use them today. So what we do is we go through and find roots that might go somewhere. For example, this particular one, it really looks like, this might even look like a small tree. We can kind of tuck this in here, trim this long part off, and then we can glue some foliage to that. Another smaller piece like this, you may notice that there's there's a curvature to it. You can probably see it better there. And that will do really well inside of our wheel wells. So the next step of the process is for me to actually go through all of these things and find roots that sort of match various pieces. If you do take green wood, like roots that you just took up and cleaned, they're going to be a lot more flexible, but then when they dry out, they tend to break more easily. I find that if you let them dry and then glue them where they want to go, you have less difficulty. There are 3 types of adhesive that we're going to use for this project. The first is our good old standby tacky glue. You can see this one's been pretty beat up. Some form of super glue in case something's particularly stubborn, and toward the end, a spray mount adhesive like this Scotch Super 77. So I'm going to go through this huge pile of roots, and I'm going to find 6 or 7 that I really like for this project, and then we'll come back. Alright, I've found 3 or 4 roots that I think will be perfect for this. What we'll do is just use a little bit of PVA glue or white glue, and we're just going to kind of cement these guys in place. We don't want to have huge glops of glue on our finished project, so what we're going to do is just sort of dust the bottoms of these things with our glue. You can see here we've glued these roots sort of where we want them. And in some places, they're sticking out and they're kind of too long. That's all right. Once it's dried, we're going to use a nail clipper and we're going to trim them down to size. My idea was that I'd have several small roots coming out from like a central bush or something. And these roots would then go up into it. So that's sort of what the plan is. So we're going to let these dry, we're going to trim them, and then we're going to move ahead. Outstanding. Our roots have finally dried, so now it's time for us to do some work on some ground cover. We're going to revisit our aquarium plant, and we're going to cut the very top of it off. And that is going to be one of our bushes. And we have more than one strand from that plant, so we're going to cut off the second one too. And so we have these to add. It's best to use, I think, a hot glue gun to support some kinds of vegetation, and this would be one of those times. So we're just going to use our hot glue gun. We got it all heated up. We're just going to squeeze a little dollop of hot glue right there. And before it has a chance to harden, we're just going to force that right down in there. Okay, we're going to do the same thing over here on this side. A little bit of hot glue. And we're going to force this piece down. Now you might notice that there's a little plastic tab that's kind of sticking up in the middle of this. We're going to be able to find something to glue over that to make it look a little more natural. And we're going to do an ink wash over it too, which will also help. And to round out some of the other things that we'll probably want for our vegetation, we don't just want aquarium plants. So I've dusted off some things that I found on my shelf. I have some lichen here. This is model railroading supplies. And there's kind of an interesting little dark brown patch of it, this stuff right here. And that's something that you can pull apart and just sort of place wherever on your model. And I think it would look really good if we based a large central piece in this midsection of the Jeep. We're also going to use it to cover up some of our, some of the ends of some of our roots. So before it has a chance to dry, we're just going to force that guy down in there. It's very important to watch your fingers when you do this too, because the glue is very, very hot. They don't call it hot glue for nothing. Okay, similarly, we're going to put a little bit of it in here. And we'll give that a chance to come out. This little piece is a little stray. Good luck with that. All right. We're going to put a little more of it over here to cover this end also. So we'll pull out a little tuft of that. And we're going to lay it down in there as a little bit much. There we are. And I suppose we should probably also put a little bit of this lichen at the base of our machine gun. Outstanding. All right, that's enough lichen for the time being. We're going to move on to using some straight grass here. This stuff just came in a diorama package that I got from Scenorama. So what we'll do is we're just going to take a little bit of this out. And we can see that it's still kind of different lengths. So we're just going to take a small pair of cuticle scissors. Actually, any kind of scissors will do. So make sure you have a nice solid hold on all of it. And trim it all to the same length. All right, so now we're going to be working with a square edge. Vitally important. So what we're going to do is we're going to stand these grasses up in a tuft at the back of this place. We're going to run it right up alongside of here. So we're going to make sure we keep a real tight hold on this stuff. Going to put our hot glue inside of here on the bottom. And then we're just going to mash this right down into that space as tightly as we can. And we have to give that a second to set. Then once it's set, you'll see that there are some strands that didn't go where we wanted them to. And so we're going to end up having to trim these after things get settled. There we go. Okay, I like that. All right, so there are a couple extra ones here. So we're just going to pull those right out. All right, so everything else here looks like it's pretty well secured. Just going to kind of pull up here and see if there were any other strands. And a couple. By and large, though, we got everybody. All right, so now we can't just leave the base looking like this, right? So we're going to put a little more hot glue down here. And we're going to put a little bit of lichen across the bottom of it. And that will conceal our, there we are. And that'll conceal the base of our straight grasses. And now that we have our straight grasses, we can cut them to length. So we're going to make them about maybe this high. We don't want to overwhelm our little tree. Right, that's a good approximate height. And then we're just going to spread them out a little bit. And another place where we can put a tuft of straight grass is going to be right down here in the front. And we can get our glue gun in there too. So we'll do the same general technique. We're going to hold as close as we can to the edge. You can also just use a razor knife to trim it also. That'll give you a nice even cut. And we're just going to drop this right inside there. And we're going to force these fellas right down into it. Yeah, the only downside of hot glue is that you often have to pull away these little trails of... Yeah, no, we're just going to kind of pull out anything here that's not secured. Alright, I like the way that looks. So now we have some grass growing out of the front here. We have some lichen on it. We have our two little shrubs from our aquarium plant. We have some straight grass here in the back. We're just going to put a little bit of lichen on the bottom here. Cover our roots for our imaginary little tree. Very, very good. Okay. All right, and then the last thing that we're going to put in here is a substance called clump foliage. This is basically just clumps of green sponge. You could also just buy a sponge and tear it into little pieces and just soak it in water and green craft paint, and you'll get the same general consistency. So we're going to put one of these kind of in the middle of this. We're going to put one of them in here in the hollow. And then, we might use some little tines of sponge just to kind of pepper up, like on our tree, for some leaves and some other things. And the clump foliage is also what we're going to put on this. But we're going to use super glue for that application. That's a little bit different. All right, so let's do a little bit of hot glue down here for our clump foliage. And in a space like this, you don't really have to be too stingy. Glue. So we're just going to force this guy down in there. And we'll need another large piece for the inside of this. Yeah, something like this maybe might be good. And we're just going to pull inside of that with hot glue. And we're just going to force this in crossways. Yeah, and now we're just going to do a little bit of super glue. We're going to put some clump foliage on our tree amateur, and we're going to put some small, looks like these little tan pieces of sponge. We're just going to glue some of those to this. And we can also glue those in places where we kind of want to take attention away from things, where the glue didn't dry quite well or whatever, then we'll use it that way. All right, so let's get going on that. Alright, now I probably should have some kind of delineation between this clump foliage and this clump foliage. So we're going to put something in between this limb and that. So we're going to use a piece of lichen instead. So get all these things out of our way. And we're just going to force some glue in there. And before it dries, we're just going to drop some lichen in the space. And that will help to separate, where are we here? That'll help to separate this tree from this vegetation inside of here. Alright, so the next step is we're just going to let everything dry. We're going to give it a final haircut. And after we have that taken care of, we'll take a look at it. Oh, we have to wash these, and then we'll take a look at our finished piece. Okay, so this is our finished piece. We've only done a couple of minor changes since the last time I sat down with it. I've added a couple of flowers that I just sort of put on the middle of these bushes. I couldn't find anything else that really looked quite right. I also added just a few pieces of brown sponge, to this root, because it looked a lot like the roots that were laying here, and I wanted it to look like a dead tree. So by putting just brown on it, it certainly looks pretty dead. And I gave a final cut to the tall grasses here so that they weren't all of a completely uniform length. And the last thing I did, which is vitally important anytime you're using clump foliage, is that you have to mix white glue and water, and then give the entire thing a good painting, and then that'll soak in and bind it. Otherwise, the pieces of this will fall off. So, it looks like our piece is pretty much done. There's quite a bit of foliage and rust and things going on, and now if we have a character can pretty well take cover behind this. I'm not sure if we can, so we can easily take cover behind it. This will block line of sight. It'll make for a much more interesting battlefield than that smoke detector we talked about in clip 1. Thank you for watching. I hope you've been able to use some of these techniques in your own modeling. If you do, please shoot a video of it and put it in the comments. And I would love to. I'd love to see anything you guys do with any of these. If you liked our series of videos, please like them. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. And thank you all so very much for watching. So, here's just a quick graphic that I put together in Photoshop. It's a little bit of a before and after image. You can see on the top the chassis that we started with, and you can see on the bottom the finished product. It just shows that some of these really simple techniques can go a long way toward taking something that's garbage and turning it into something that's really, really nice.